All right, welcome to Torture Garden. I'm Scott.
I'm Jimmy.
And how are you doing today, Jimmy?
I'm doing good, man. How are you doing?
Doing well. I was excited for this conversation. You know, the last few episodes we've done have really been, specifically tied to a band or an artist or a specific genre. We've kind of covered relatively narrow topics. Of course, we veered off from there. But we haven't had one of our larger discussions. Where Jimmy and I in our own time have these big discussions about various topics in music, and this one's kind of a doozy. I picked this one because it kind of really hammers down a big topic in music discourse. Probably one of the biggest aspects of modern music discourse is the music review. Jimmy and I have slightly different views about the relevance of music reviews, whether or not they're helpful, whether or not positive reviews or negative reviews, or one or the other or both are useful. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of have a conversation about our own opinions about it. I thought it'd be interesting to break it down into just kind of a general overview. Kind of we both give our takes on it, and then we dive into the good, the bad, and then kind of come around at the end. So
sounds good with me.
Having it be not to put you on the spot, Jimmy, but having it be that reviews are kind of, obviously, they're the norm. They're the status quo. Most people would say that reviews are at least accepted, whether or not they like it or not. I kind of wanted to throw it to you first to kind of give your opinion about, your overview of reviews. What your thoughts are on reviews, just because you kind of represent the antithetical opinion, the kind of the outsider, because
what a change from my daily life.
Well, just because every music blog, every source of music discourse runs reviews, so it's just kind of accepted that that's a part of the discourse. So it's I kind of wanted to hear your opinion about why I think you have a relatively, I don't want to say negative, but just you kind of push back on the need for reviews. So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I think it's not that I'm not against reviews per se, but I'm against the power that they hold right now. Mm-hmm. I think it's more we need to redefine what music criticism is for the modern era, because I wrote this article for Heavy Blog way back in the day that sort of covered this. That I think back in the day when we didn't have the internet, and we didn't have, the world wasn't as connected as it is now. We didn't have something like Bandcamp up. We relied on reviews. We relied on Rolling Stone and Village Voice and, even DIY punk scenes and things like that to, get recommendations. Or, we'd go to the record store and, ask the big guy there who's working there, what's good, what sounds like this. And so I think in that time, I think it helped. I don't think it was perfect. I think it's very far from perfect, because I think there are some albums that get lambasted at first and then are just regarded as classics.
Yep.
I mean, just look at Miles Davis's career. It's full of that. I mean, you could keep going on and on and on. But it's so I think it's just I think we need to refocus on what it means now, because I think nowadays I think it should be more it should feel more like recommendations. I think because back then it seemed like those people were the only voices in music that you listen to them. It's almost like Roger Ebert back in the 90s. That whatever he thumbed up you saw. And I'm not necessarily against that. I'm always up for hearing recommendations. I like hearing other people's opinions on things like that, but I just don't like the power that a lot of these people hold, and the influence, because they, for them it's it's either shit or it's the greatest thing ever. And if it's shit, nobody's gonna listen to it. And it's some people might like it. So when it comes to negative reviews, I tend not to like them. Ironically though, just a little interlude. I love watching Anthony Fantano's negative reviews, just because he always he very succinctly puts what he feels like is wrong with the album. I think he does a very good job in explaining why. But I think it's just funny to see him just, be in pain sometimes with these albums. But regardless of the point, I don't think, and he actually did a video, not too long ago talking about negative reviews and how we need them. I would disagree. And I think because his reasoning is that, we need negative reviews because, if something's bad, we should just say that, it always seems like we're in a culture that is increasingly going towards, oh, everything's okay, everything's fine, you get a prize just for participating, and I think he's just trying to do that, sort of root that out a little more. Mm-hmm. And my thought of it is just I just don't think a negative review is just helpful in any way, because I think that all it does is it tells people don't listen to this, when I think what you should really do is be looking at the review itself, or looking at what the band is known for, what the artist is known for, and going from there, because I think there are some people who might really like an album that gets negatively reviewed. So I just think it's it's sort of unfair in a way, because I feel like you're denying some potential music fans against certain types of music, and so I prefer, I think that we should sort of shift the medium the way it is right now towards recommendations. I'm probably going to reference, the Needle Drop, a dozen more times today, because I find him to be just a very, very smart source of inspiration for this type of thing. Mm-hmm. But he even does Why You Know Review, because there are people who hound him for stuff, and he's just I'm not interested in this, so he gives his opinion. Mm-hmm. Even if it's just really quick, I think that works. But I'm so sick of someone saying, oh, this is not worth your time, when it could be worth someone's time. Not necessarily everybody. Look at the new Queens of the Stone Age album. It's been really mixed lately. I've seen a lot of people who have not been a fan of it, and they actually consider it the band's worst album to date. But then at the same time, you have Jonathan on Heavy Blog, who thought it was really good, or at least he didn't think it was to the level of Rated R or Clockwork. Yeah. But it was still decent and worthy of of listening. I think it's just it all comes down to one man's trash is another man's treasure. Yeah. So, and I think considering how freaking just immense music has become now, just because it's just expanded so much, you will never hear all the albums that come out in a single year. Oh yeah, it would take you the rest of your life to just listen to one single year of music. So it's just I think what the critic's job should be now is to just say, hey, this is out, either, oh, I really like this, give this a try, or I don't personally like this, but I think somebody might. Yeah. I think that's a good attitude to take, rather than this is garbage, keep away from it. And I think I'm just gonna say this before I let you put your opinion, that I think there are bad albums all the time. There are albums that I don't like, but this is when I started writing for Heavy Blog, I did a couple reviews. I did 2 reviews, and then I stopped because I figured that if you like the band, you'll probably go listen to the album. And so I just never thought that me personally reviewing it would do any good, in a way. So I don't know if I explained myself as succinctly as I could, but
no, you didn't. I think what's interesting is that we don't. I was expecting to have a true pro-con about reviews, but we do share quite a bit of overlap on what we think. Okay, so overall, TLDR, I have a net positive view of reviews. I think that they have a value. I appreciate their place in music criticism. I don't think they are the be all end all, and I think that's something you would agree with, Jimmy. It's something that you touched on. I think they're useful for the fact that they do present a distilled opinion of specific music blogs' taste in music, and why.
Yeah, but can I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
It doesn't represent the blog as a whole, though. Like,
Yes.
Like, and I think that's something right there is that a lot of publications I saw this within by looking in the backs in behind the scenes in Heavy Blog, how divided a lot of people were over certain albums. Like what comes to mind, like the new Oathbreaker album from last year. I saw people, exactly.
Yeah.
Like you weren't a huge fan of that, but everybody else was just losing their minds over it.
It's interesting for that fact. I'm not behind the scenes at Pitchfork, and I would actually love to be behind the scenes and understand. They have a really bizarre rating system where they have, it's not by zeros and fives. It's they can go across the whole gamut of 0 to 10. So I'm curious if that is kind of an aggregate of everyone's opinion or the score. But anyway, it's odd to defend such an imperfect system. It's odd to kind of talk about the value, because I do think they have a value, but at the same time, if you look at it, it's one person's subjective opinion with the name of a big blog behind them. Pitchfork, for example, someone writes a review, they have the Pitchfork name behind them, but like Jimmy said, it's not the whole blog. As you can see by, sometimes they post each individual writer's year-end list and whatnot. It'll show that they don't necessarily agree on an album. Some people have the same album in their top 5, or even as their album of the year. Some people won't even have that album on their list at all. It really depends. Just to kind of sidestep that into why I think it's important is, Pitchfork writers kind of come from the same background relatively. They kind of have the same mindset. And any number of blogs I follow, Cavalt Nation, Noisy, Invisible Oranges, Decoder, stuff like that. They all kind of come from a similar type of curatorial idea. And when you see a review for something, even before you get into the review, even before you get to the score, even before you get to any number of the texts, you know what type of blog you're looking at. You know what type of blog you're reading. And you see what they have picked. And this even we haven't even gotten to the review process. It goes to a curatorial process. This specific blog, you know what they cover, you know what album they've picked. And then from there you can go to different context clues. What's the name of the band, the album cover and whatnot. And you can kind of see, is this worth my time? And that's, I think, the value of music reviews, is not only is it that they picked an album in general to cover. For example, KO Dot is one of my favorite bands. I discovered them on Pitchfork. Pitchfork roasted them in their review. It was of Blue Lamb and See Downward, I believe.
And which I was an album that I came around to. It took me a long time too.
But I enjoyed it, and Pitchfork destroyed it. But it sounded interesting. The album cover was cool. The description, even though the description was bad, their description criticized it, but their kind of summary of the album interested me. So even though it was a bad review, it caught my attention, and it was definitely a Pitchfork-esque album, an album they would cover. So I think the value is that you can see the type of blog that's covering it, you see the type of music that's being covered, and you can kind of mediate whether or not you're interested in it. There are tons of albums I find on Pitchfork. I may not read the review, or I may not agree with the review, but to see that they're covering it brought it to my attention to begin with, and I didn't even know, that it was something that existed, and there's that. But also,
I think you bring up a good point right there, is that that coverage is important. I personally like that. Like, I'll go over Sputnik Music to see what they have sometimes. I don't usually like what they put out, but it's interesting to see.
Exactly. So that would be my bullet point A. Bullet point B is that you can. This kind of came to my attention. So I've been, just as a disclaimer, I maybe should have said this at the beginning. I've been reviewing music since freshman year of
2011?
college. Yeah, 2011, 2012. I've been reviewing music, so for quite a while now, on and off. I first reviewed for a blog called The New Review, which is no longer active. It went under for a number of reasons, personal to the owners of the blog. But in watching, this really brought to the forefront that it's not a review from The New Review. It's a review from whichever writer is writing it, because you see each of the personalities at play in the blog. You see a review from John Doe versus Jane Doe, and how they have different opinions about music in general, and especially seeing, we had a kind of a blog group where we would talk as people. Understanding their actual personal approaches to music was very helpful in understanding how they reviewed it and how they understood it and how they analyzed it. So when you would see a review from reviewer X and you would read their opinion, you would be able to understand, where they were coming from. And I think that's valuable because when you read a review from someone, for example, the Needle Drop, Anthony Fantano, as you mentioned, you kind of have an idea of where he comes from. So when he gives something a bad review or a good review, and based on his argument, I can take from that, and not only can I kind of assess whether or not I will enjoy the album, but B, take something from his analysis. There's been plenty of times I've read both positive and negative reviews and had my opinions of that album shifted. Albums I liked, which I've, maybe not stopped listening to or grown to dislike because of a review, but I've kind of analyzed it in a different way. Or the inverse, albums I didn't like, where I read a positive review and it helped me to appreciate it more and sometimes even enjoy it. I think there's value in being challenged in your opinion, not only because it can help you shape your view of an album that you may not have enjoyed to become something that you will listen to on a regular basis, but more importantly, it makes it so that you can dislike things about an album and still enjoy it. It makes you more critical of what you're listening to. I've found that the more I've read reviews and the more I've written reviews, it's made me more selective of what I listen to. Kind of as you mentioned, Jimmy, there's an enormous amount of music that comes out every year, and constantly having a critical mind and constantly reading stuff that is critical of music. And that doesn't mean that it's intelligently critical. It just means that you inherently have the mindset that you want to critique music. You want to find music that's good, and you want to understand why music is good, why it's bad, or whatever. It helps you to be more selective of what you're listening to, and it helps you to kind of better appreciate music, and it helps you to enjoy music more and dislike music you don't want to listen to.
Yeah, I see. I get your point there, and I agree to a certain extent. I just think that you bring up that you need, or at least it seems like you're intimating maybe that that you need reviews to have a critical mindset. And I personally would disagree, because like it would be like saying that you have no taste in art because you've never analyzed, like maybe because you've never read a critic's review of a piece of art.
Yeah.
And I just so strongly disagree with that. It'd be like saying like, oh yeah, I'm a I love Charles Dickens, but you haven't read any Dickensian criticism, like, oh well, you're just a Philistine.
Yeah.
I think, and part of this goes into how I consume music and art, because I think there was a time that I used to even look at reviews, and I think I still do, but I really only look at them on like a cursory level. I just don't really even take any of it to heart. But for me now, I don't need a review, because I know what I like, and I know sort of the direction that something would bring me in. If I read a review, it'll be for certain keywords, and if those keywords pop up, yeah, I'll go for it. But I'm not going to go if it's like a 10 or a 9 or a 1 or whatever. I'm just going to go for whatever sounds good. I think it's you sort of like I like to use the term like music explorer. Like, I think there are some people that will stick to their bands or their type of music, and then there's people like me and you who really explore
Yeah.
and try to find new things. And I'm always down for that, but I also have an idea of what I personally like to explore into
Yeah.
too. So like I usually keep those, I keep those channels free. Like, I follow the Free Jazz Collective. They're, I think you follow them too.
I
right?
do, yeah.
Yeah, they're a great blog.
Yeah, no, they're
I think,
fantastic, absolutely.
I think the reviews are really good. But I really don't read the reviews much. I just, I honestly, I sort of go by the numbers that they put down there. And even then, I don't always agree with them. Like, for instance, they picked the new Wadada Leo Smith album to be like their album of the year, America's National Parks. And I just had that on the other day, and I don't think it's a bad album by any means, but I just don't see it as, like as something that would be indicative of album of the year. And that thing was like really critically acclaimed. Like it like a lot of people really love that album. But it's just, I think it comes down to opinions, and it's just like, like my favorite line from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, that every opinions are like assholes. Everybody has one, and they all stink.
Yeah. So first of all, I didn't mean to insinuate, and I'm sorry if I did that. I don't think.
I know you better.
Well,
that's
yeah.
So
I think it's important to clarify. I don't mean you need to, read reviews to think critically about music. I would never. I didn't mean to suggest that. What I meant is that it helped me to think critically. But I think more importantly, just talking critically about music. I think one of the powers of social media is being able to have your, if you have a group of people who have relatively similar musical tastes, or if you have friends you can talk to music about. I used to have friends in high school, or college rather, where literally every major metal album that came out, one of my friends would come to my room and be like, "Hey, did you hear the new Behemoth? It's fucking ill." "Hey, did you hear the new Cannibal Corpse? It's fucking ill."
Is that how he said it?
It literally, yes, it's fucking ill, right? It's fucking great, yeah. And and like that's he's from Boston, so he's like, fucking ill. It's a fucking great album, yeah. But it's funny because like that was not constructive. Just to have every major metal album, new fucking Gojira, it's fucking ill. Like that's not helpful. It's not critical. Granted, I think the new Behemoth album is great, so it was cool to have him share that opinion. But
I think what you're trying to say is that I think reviews can sometimes give you the words that you just didn't think of, that were on the tip of your tongue, but you couldn't properly elucidate them.
Yeah, for example, I'm a real, just to go sidestep music a little bit. I'm relatively to the left politically. Most of my close friends, or relatively close friends and family, are to the right. So it's nice to be able to go online and go in different people's and at least talk about my leftist opinions and whatnot, and shape those and have some feedback. If you constantly come into contact, obviously you don't want to get into an echo chamber, like I said with my friend, where everything was great, everything was ill, everything was fantastic. That's not helpful. But you want to be able to approach things with someone who has a mindset of what you're talking about, and perhaps a different opinion, and that's where reviewers come in. Obviously I don't think you need to read reviewers to have that critical mindset, but if you don't have anyone around you or anyone on social media that is relatively close, similarly minded about music, or likes the same type of music and has that kind of critical aspect, it's going to leave you in the dark, both in their willingness to find new music to share with you, but also their criticalness of music. If you're constantly surrounded by people who are just totally on board with every new metal album that comes out, for example, or whatever, that's not great for being critical. Jimmy and I very often disagree about music that we both love. Artists that we both share an interest in, or both follow closely, will disagree about, or there's artists that Jimmy, you'll find that you'll suggest to me, artists I'll find a suggest to you. It's good to have that conversation with someone who
definitely.
And that's all I was saying. Obviously it doesn't have to be through reviews, but I think that's one good way of having that dialogue.
I would argue though that I think art naturally creates that. I think that it's tough but I think it's a little bit easier now if you consider it, back when, let's say just like punk was just starting out, and like, it was like near to impossible to find other punks unless you like lived in a city.
Yeah.
Or
you lived right near that scene, wherever.
Yeah, exactly. I think now you can find people online and everywhere, but I think art part of the great thing about art in general is that it brings people together to be able to talk about things, in certain ways, and you get to sort of open your mind a little bit and explore more. I think it's a natural occurrence of that. I think that it's just it just sucks sometimes to see the amount of influence we give some critics, because I think that I like everybody's a critic. I mean, it's very much like euphemism now, but it's nonetheless it's nonetheless true, because if you're thinking about music in any way, you're a critic. And I think we tend to forget that. But at the same time, I can't help but think of this. There's a Susan Sontag essay called "Against Interpretation" that is really about sort of like people's interpretation of art and especially literature in this regard. But in one of the quotes is one of her biggest quotes from that is that like interpretation is the the academics' revenge against artists. And I want to change that, saying that criticism, I think, is like the people's reaction or jealousy of artists, because I think there are a lot of people who like I think we talk a big game sometimes, but it's like sometimes you just want to tell them to either put up or shut up. And I don't think that's necessarily a great argument to have, because it's like, okay, just because you can rap like Kendrick Lamar, or just because Kendrick Lamar can rap really well, it doesn't mean shit. Like, there's more to it than what you can do personally. Like, I think, but all that to say before I get completely off track is that there's like I just don't like the almost like the aristocraticness, the elitism that seems inherent in a lot of art criticism of art these days. That like a piece of art isn't good unless it's critically acclaimed, which I just think is such bullshit. Because all it's really doing is just sort of tickling the right people at the right time. And like taste always change, so it just seems sort of impermanent. But you know what, you brought this up just a little bit, you touched on it a little bit. I really like to talk about this though, the idea of the number system in like Pitchfork, because I know that you I know, because while I was with Heavy Blog, you guys decided to do away with numbers. And I don't think your position's changed with that.
No, I think it's very limiting to the writer and to the reader. It gives them a cop out from actually reading what the reviewer has to say. I don't think there's really any benefit other than to dumb it down, which I don't think is helpful to anyone. No.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that numbers mean different things.
Exactly, and it's hilarious. I mean, obviously, music criticism is subjective in general, but it's hilariously subjective. Like not only is it subjective from the reviewer, but just the system from which the blog would review something is incredibly subjective. I mean, I rate all the movies I watch just to keep them organized, and since IMDb only uses like a 1 to 10 scale, I don't really use that in terms of like how good it is. They all mean different things. So like basically going down, like there's no such thing as a 10 for me, because 10 would be a perfect movie, and there is no perfect movie. But like a 9 would be like really good, and I'd watch it over and over again. But then 8 would be like really, really good, but I could really only watch that once. And so it just keeps going down from there. So like, but my ratings mean different things, but it's more for me to keep it organized. Like it's sort of like genre labels, like I have, ridiculous genre labels on my iPod, everything from like, progressive metal to post metal to hardcore punk, like all that crap. And, I don't necessarily agree with all of it. Like, Tom Waits, technically, like, I think I have him like in rock, which is, I guess,
you know,
Might
I
be the
guess
best
that works.
label. Well, the
Either
easiest
that or
label.
singer
Yeah.
songwriter, but even then, I just don't think either is good enough. But I
Yeah.
just do it just because it just makes things easier to organize. It's not necessarily something I agree with.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
So something you said is that you didn't mean to get off the rails, but I kind of like that we've kind of gone off the typical good, bad, and the ugly structure, because it's good to talk about this more loosely. And I think I'd like to get into some of my negatives of reviewing, because I've been kind of talking positively, but
I'd love to hear them.
I think that it's not so much about first I'll go into the more corporate issues I have, but there are some other issues as well. But I think with the modern review format and the modern blog format, reviews have kind of become maybe not clickbait, but kind of attraction for traffic. They've been meant to, everything, every big album needs a review just because everyone wants to read it. There needs to be discourse around it, because you publish a review, whether or not people agree with it or disagree with it. Kanye West is a great example. Any new Kanye West review, no matter what the blog, whatever, you're going to publish it. And no matter, regardless of whether the review is good or bad, you're going to have the people coming out, the Kanye fanboys and the people who shit on Kanye. And depending on what the review is, they're going to be on one side or the other. But it's a great way to drive clicks, and it is a good way to drive discourse. Every new Kanye album, I think the discourse has gone a little bit more critical of him. I think up till My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, people were very much, he's God. He's the new.
I would disagree with that. Just because I think that a lot of people considered My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy to be sort of a shot in the arm for his career, sort of a resurgence. Just because before that, it's not like he was doing anything bad, but it was sort of on that slow downhill decline. But then that album just shot it back up.
Well, I think it was a brief dip with 808 and Heartbreaks. I think
exactly.
Which you're right. To be fair, that was a misstep. But I think it was kind of a weird context because it was around the death of his mother and whatnot. So maybe his career wasn't on a steady decline. But I think the point I was making was going more forward from that range. I think virtually everyone was 100% on board with fans, whatever. That's not to say it was universally acclaimed. Period. I would say I'm critical of that album. Other people were as well. But I think from there, you see, albums like Yeezus and whatnot get a lot of pushback. And kind of, you see, the machine of music criticism you see the cracks. Or you start to see that a lot of these blogs just kind of have this mindset, they have ththese narratives. Nick Cusworth, he's a colleague of mine on Heavy Blog. He likes to talk about the narrative of the blogosphere, which is true. If you follow any modern genre or movement in a certain certain genre or whatever, you can tell that they're basing these big new album reviews off of what they assume or what they think the genre should be doing. So it's clear that, and that's just a larger point to make, that a lot of these blogs have an ulterior motive. They have an idea of these bands are doing this, these bands are doing that, and they should be doing this. This is what the genre should be going, and that's how they review things.
It's also worth noting the political dimension of that, because I think a lot of people expect this album to be political or what have you, or that if something isn't political enough, or if you're not taking the right stance, I think that sometimes can come into play, which is really unfair, because some artists don't want to bother with that shit, or at least they have their own political opinions and they don't really care what yours is, but I think a great example of this was the new Depeche Mode album. It's far from the band's best, but it got a lot of really good traction because of the political bent of the lyrics. And I think that sort of sucks because, on the musical side of things, and even the lyrical, even lyrically, it was not very good. And so, but it gets, pushed up because, it's 2017 and the world's shit, and, we need to talk about that, and anything that does it is automatically good. which is not exactly true, because there are plenty of political albums out there that they're just garbage.
Yeah.
And I think the reverse is true too. I mean, we've talked about this last week with the hardcore punk scene. I mean, I love Dead Kennedys, love me some Dead Kennedys. So
yeah, exactly, and I think even obviously the politics are important with people like Kendrick and even J. Cole, even though I think J. Cole is unfairly held up as or just kind of oddly, that's a different rant. But I don't think he's as political. Anyway, people will hold artists to barometers. It's not as political as J. Cole. For example, New Joy Badass. It was trying to be political, but not as political as Kendrick Lamar. And that you can talk about whether or not that's fair or not. But these reviews don't exist in a vacuum, and a lot of these reviewers are reviewing things based on what they see public reaction and what they assume. A great example of that, and I will go back to this example till the day I die, about how reviews are not inherently unbiased and how they may not be worthwhile. Let's go back to, when was this published? Sorry, I have it up on my computer. March 13th, 2001, the review of Daft Punk's Discovery on Pitchfork received a 6.4. The review closes out by saying, prog and disco have never openly begged for their own hybrid, but the genre's newborn Frankenbaby is alive, whether we like it or not. Still, this beast, however grotesque, is relatively harmless. Then it goes on from there, but it just goes to show that this was not an overwhelmingly positive review. They pushed back on it. They said that Daft Punk's approach to house music was ugly. It was, crashed together, not that great. This was back in 2001. Not a terrible review, but not a great review. Fast forward to 2010, when Pitchfork publishes their top 200 albums of the 2000s. Where do you think Discovery lands?
Pretty high.
Number 3 of 200. Number 3. It opens by saying Daft Punk's first album that had helped refresh house music in the mid-1990s. And then it goes on later to say Discovery was simply the decade's best good times record, with Daft Punk as pyramid-toting party wizards and the chipmunk craftwork of Harder, Better, Faster, Stronger, their anthem. And it just goes to show that why do you think that album jumped from a 6.4 and seen as a Frankenbaby to the third best album of the decade?
I think there's I know you're probably thinking that just because it got popular that they're going to change their mind, and I would agree with that at least partially, but I think it's also worth saying that like we talked about before, it's not like they collectively review an album. The only time that they collectively do stuff is with lists like this. So like I think the collective opinion differed from that single reviewer's thoughts on the album.
But with their 2001 list where they did rank collectively, this Discovery either didn't rank or it ranked very lowly. I'm pretty sure it didn't rank at all. So to me, and who's to say, but it's interesting to me that from everything that they presented, it seems like the public opinion in this case, and I'm not saying this happens for all their reviews, this is just an example of how in some cases it does influence how they change their minds. Because I don't know how you can go from how they treated this in 2001 to how they treated this in 2010 without considering the fact that Daft Punk became one of the biggest electronic artists ever.
Okay, well, I that's the thing. I agree that it's definitely pretty, it's pretty skeezy, sort of. But I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing in a way. I think when it comes to their integrity as a music publication, yes, it's not very good. But I think it's good at the same time that maybe they re-listened to something, because I mean like I talked about earlier, Miles Davis, like the Electric Era, initially was like Bitches Brew was not liked.
Yeah.
It's like Ornette Coleman's Free Jazz was not liked, and today those are regarded as two of the most important jazz albums of all time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and it's not necessarily because I think it's probably we're saying here that all those albums that we necessarily think of as the greatest of all time, they aren't necessarily the greatest. It's more that they influenced all these artists so much. But I think that that's sort of going beyond the point. That's a different conversation altogether. It's just that like, you know, I think a lot of those critics that initially poo-pooed, you know, Coleman and Miles, you know, I think they gave it another try, or at least, you know, like I think sometimes you need, like, I think everybody has their own gateway into a certain type of music. You know, I think some of them can be similar to others. You know, some people have the same gateway. You know, it'd be like saying, like, you know, like, because like for jazz, you know, like Kind of Blue was like one of the albums that got me into jazz. Same thing with Headhunters, you know. But that might not be the same thing for someone else. It might be like Chet Baker, or it might be, you know, like Wadada Leo Smith, or it could be, you know, Louis Armstrong, you know. So I think it all depends on, you know, I mean, it obviously it always comes down to subjectivity, that everybody has their own opinion on things. And I just think that, you know, I think that with these publications, with these reviews, we sort of put like a permanence to them, which isn't necessarily fair to the reviewer in a way, because, you know, their tastes change. I mean, Anthony Fantano did a video a couple months ago about, you know, some opinions of his that have changed. And, you know, he's like, you know, I'm not going to go back and change my videos, because I think at that time that's what I thought. But I think nowadays my opinions differ, you know. And he goes back to even like, you know, Tom Waits' As Bad As Me, you know, which he didn't give that like a great score to begin with, but he admitted that he likes it even less now. And I mean, we're talking about someone who's, you know, a pretty big Tom Waits fan, who, you know, so it's, you know, I think it's just that like we end up putting these sort of timestamps on these reviewers, and while I don't think that what Pitchfork has done, like, in like there are numerous accounts of Pitchfork doing something like that, you know, aside from Discovery, but, you know, I don't think what they did is good, but I don't think we should completely shit on them for it at the same time. And I say this as someone who generally does not like Pitchfork, because I can only take so much political shit in one day.
I think so. I do think, you know, I agree with what you're saying. I think what tampers it for me in terms of like a blog like Pitchfork is the finality with which they say things, you know, the definitive nature of which they speak of things. And another great example is the fact that they never reviewed Taylor Swift's 1989, but included it as one of their best albums of 2015 or 2016, I forget. Or 2014, whenever year it came out, which I think is interesting.
But
that they
I think it's just, you know, this is, sorry to interrupt. I just think it's puerile in a way to, you know, you even consider those lists definitive in any sort of way, just because, you know, it's so fucking subjective. You know, like, I remember, and I mean, I used to get really riled up about this stuff. I remember way back when I was getting really into metal, and, you know, like, Metallica was, like, my first metal band, and I looked on, you know, Wikipedia's thing for, like, the Rolling Stones top 10 guitarists. Kirk Hammett was, like, number 11. I was like, that's bullshit. You know, fucking Jimi Hendrix was first. So I actually went into Wikipedia and edited it and put in a huge comment about it, because I was a stupid Metallica fanboy.
But so here's the ultimate end game of where I'm trying to get with this. I maybe should have prefaced. So I do think that this does kind of damper, you know, in a way, the, you know, reputation, or not the reputation, but kind of the platform of Pitchfork. And I don't mean that in that kind of like you're saying. I don't think Pitchfork should be held to that account. Because, like you said, even with, you know, people criticize Anthony Fantano for being, quote, he made a video about this, quote unquote, a normal guy, and his reviews don't matter.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, okay, but what about all the normal people at Pitchfork? So suddenly, because they have the, quote unquote, Pitchfork name above them, suddenly they mean more? No. It means that everything that they say, you should take as mediated. You know, everything you say, you should take it as, you know, helping to inform your own opinion if you want to, or just for curatorial purposes, but it should not be be-all, end-all. And the reason I think it's important to have this conversation and to say that these places are imperfect and this is the way we should approach it is because I've had conversations with people who have said, I've had people literally say to me, if you don't like the Beatles, you're wrong. I've had people say to me that if you don't like My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, or if you don't think it's a top 5 hip-hop album or a top 3 hip-hop album, you're wrong. Someone I was in a conversation with literally said I was uncultured swine because I didn't like My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. Now,
see, I'm not gonna defend what they say because I definitely do not agree. I'm definitely on your side in this, but I think it's worth saying that I think this is where some personal restraint can come into play. That you don't necessarily need to deal with that shit. Like it's tough to ignore stuff like that, but you sort of learn. Because I mean, like, what the hell does it mean?
Yeah, I am not saying that it did not offend me. It was just like, okay, yeah. It rolled my eyes and was like, I was able to, those comments come from people I knew in real life, people I knew online, people I barely knew, whatever. It was a range of people.
You've brought this exact situation up many times before, so obviously it sticks in your craw a little bit.
Because, and it's not because it offends me, it's because I think it shows why it's important to approach reviews and the critical eye and these kind of set in stone critical opinions. We can get I haven't brought up Rolling Stone because Rolling Stone is a whole nother mess to talk about.
Rolling Stone is just like the worst aspects of Pitchfork sort of personified.
Exactly. There's just too much to dissect.
Yeah.
But I think the reason it's important to approach music this way and to kind of understand that these publications are not omnipotent. They're regular people who do have, to be fair, a very strong background with music, obviously, and do have usually have, at least some writing ability or whatnot. I think it's important to approach music that way. And this is, what I'm getting at is that the problems in music criticism is mainly, the way it's been perceived and the strength and the power it's been given by people to then inform what they think about artists. Not to say that obviously the Beatles are incredibly influential band, incredibly important, deserve praise, but to think that you can then say, well, this body of evidence of critical support makes it so that they're an infallible band, I think that's a little ridiculous. And
sorry to interrupt. I think it's worth pointing out that there's a difference between, like you said, that, I think we end up sort of blurring the lines between, music's like an art's influence on history and our own opinions on it. And I'm not saying that this is just us. I blame Rolling Stone for a lot of this too, because there's no way Bob Dylan appears that much in Rolling Stone, in the greatest albums of all time, like especially near the top. I'm just saying, like, like I think we often confuse the two.
Mm-hmm.
That like just because an album is historically important doesn't necessarily mean that you need to like it.
Exactly, and I think that is the and of course in the end, because I think we're kind of nearing the end here, is like not to say this doesn't matter, but this really is up to what you want to take out of music criticism. This could be incredibly important to you. You could really look to blogs to form your taste, and whether that means just what they cover and taking those as suggestions, or really with their opinions and taking those opinions and really taking those as your own. But it's important to approach these people with grains of salt. And I really do encourage you to watch the Needle Drops video about, quote unquote, I'm just a regular guy, because it's very interesting to me, not only just his response, but, and this is, I know, he gets, criticized or whatever, but I think this video is important in what it shows, because the questioner himself was saying, you're not a guy, you're not like a reviewer or whatever, you're just a person or whatever. And he made it seem like he somehow was less of a good and informed voice just because he was a person and he was just one guy. But it's interesting to me because what do you think Pitchfork is? What do you think all of these blogs are? They're not just one guy, to be fair. They're a collection of people but they're all the same. Like they're not extra special like critics. So
Well, to be fair, I don't really consider pitchfork reviewers to really even be people. So
but no, but it's interesting because it's really like they're no different. You know, they're really no different than Anthony Fantano. It's just that there's a lot of Anthony Fantanos that are reviewing for them. So it's really, if that's what you think about Anthony Fantano, or if that's what you think about any specific reviewer, I mean that's what music review, criticism is. You know, it's people who are passionate about music, who are passionate about writing, and want to combine the two in a way that's meaningful to them and to recommend good music. And I think that's valuable in, curating music that you want to listen to, finding value in albums you might not have enjoyed before, or kind of be more critical about music in general. But it really, you need to have not even a grain of salt. You need to down a whole salt shaker before you go into understanding music criticism. It's important for your own taste, not just blindly follow, okay, well, all the critics say X, all the critics say Y. Great example, to Pimp a Butterfly, Kendrick Lamar, universally acclaimed. I happen to love the album. Jimmy happens to not like it as much as, the general consensus.
I find Kendrick very overrated, just to be fair.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Jimmy and myself, neither of you are wrong or right. That's just our interpretation of it. And in some ways, whether in good or bad ways, the critical consensus has helped shape our views of how we think of Kendrick and his music, in some way at least, as well, yeah. And more importantly, as his music. And that's the most important part, is that his music has helped us inform our opinions of his music more so than the critics, but it all has contributed, at least for me, into my understanding of his lyrics or whatnot, or what his music means and the context of what it's in. But just because the critical consensus is that this album is perfect or near perfect doesn't mean someone like Jimmy can, not like it. It doesn't mean that he's wrong. And just because I don't like it as much as everyone else does, that doesn't mean I'm wrong. That's because, these reviewers help us to see what music is out there and perhaps see what we might think of music, or help us to inform what we might think of music. But in general, it's just meant as a framing device, a light framing device.
I think that's the important word right there, is that framing device. It's, like I talked about at the beginning, I think we need to reconsider how we look at music criticism today. I think that's it, is that we need to stop looking at these reviewers as the authority, because frankly, you can cultivate your own musical opinion. It's not completely above you. Like you're not so plebeian and lowbrow that you're unable to, like nobody is. Like those lowbrow, highbrow terms, those things don't really exist. They're just stuff that elitists make up to try to keep that schism going. It's just I think above all, because I highly suggest using reviewers, if you're new to music, because I think seeing those lists of what the best jazz albums are and things like that, those are good gateways to help you discover your own tastes. Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, you can, there is nothing more important than your own taste. And, at least when it comes to you liking art, you don't have to like anything that you don't want to.
Yeah.
If you don't like something, that's fine. But I think what reviewers do is supposed to at least really supposed to not. I don't think all reviewers always think this, especially Rolling Stone, but that it's meant to be a recommendation. It's meant to say, hey, to point a flag out of just the expansive sea of music, saying, hey, this is worth seeing, this is worth trying out.
Mm-hmm.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
I still stand by my opinions on reviews. I don't personally use them as much anymore. I'm always, I'll always go and rate new music and check out their charts feature.
Yeah.
I think that's a great feature. But in no way do I consider it final or definitive of my own tastes, because I would say 99% of the time it is not like my own tastes. So,
yeah.
But it's nonetheless, if you're always willing to explore, I think that's the most important thing, is to be able to always keep your mind open, but also have an idea of what you like.
Exactly, and I'm actually really glad that this conversation kind of went all over the place because this really is a complicated uh, issue. You know, there
Yeah.
are people who really place a lot of emphasis on what a Pitchfork review will say or any other,
Which is not a good idea.
which yeah, we disagree with. And well, you know, I do think reviews have a place. Kind of like I said before, is I think you know if you take a TLDR from this whole conversation, it's a really strong framing device. It's a good idea
Yeah.
to see, you know, what these people, you know, Pitchfork, for example, will do, you know, a review of when a whole artist catalog is reissued or whatever, and they'll review
Yeah.
all of their albums, and it's kind of like a rate your music type thing. But you know, the difference is that you have an actual person reviewing it versus just an aggregate, and of course, you know, there's pros and cons to both forms, but it's really a framing device. You know, you look at these different sources, what they think of an album, and then you go from there. And of course, you know, you have Spotify, you have YouTube, you have Bandcamp, all these different apps where you can form your own opinion. So even more so than ever, whereas, you know, Jimmy had mentioned back in the past when there was no internet, it was truly crucial for to have these music reviews to understand what was worth buying because you couldn't try it before you buy. Now that you can, it really has more than ever become a framing device to help you form what music is worth listening to. But at the end of the day, don't leave it from making you checking out something that you would want to check out. You know, if someone gives something a bad review,
Exactly.
then just still listen to it. I mean, what are you going to lose? You can shut it off after a song or two if you don't like it.
Yeah, like I mean, I you know, to go back to Anthony Fantano, I really I admire the guy a lot. I'm a big fan of his channel, but I would say that for the most part, I usually disagree with his opinions on music, and that's just because we have different tastes. But
Yeah.
you know, I'm always I like that he's at least willing to explain why he doesn't like something.
Exactly.
You know, and he's able to give you concrete examples, and probably most important of all is at the end of the day, if you don't agree with him, he doesn't give a shit either way because he knows that he has his opinion and you have yours. So
Exactly.
that's maybe that's the best way to leave it off. So
Exactly. So, I mean, thanks so much for listening to our, you know, our conversation. I'm sure there's many more points we didn't touch
Oh,
upon,
yeah.
but I think this is
we can make sequels
we
of
could,
this.
but I do think, you know, the TLDR, what we want to talk about, you know, I've said it a few times, which is funny because it's supposed to make it easier to talk about, but there's just so many summaries of this issue is just, you know, really reviews have their place, but especially considering what we have as tools today as listeners, it shouldn't be taken as the be all. You know, it's not gospel.
Exactly.
And, you know, I still use reviews. You know, I'll still go on Pitchfork or still go on other blogs to see what they covered, read what they say, find great new music because of it. I would never just take a review as gospel. I would never take it as the be all end all of what I should be listening to. So yeah, I mean, you know, thanks again for listening to us, you know, ramble on about reviews. You know, it's something I'm passionate about as a reviewer for wow, like over 5 years. That's crazy. It's really weird to think I've been reviewing music for like half a decade. But anyway, I'm getting old.
You're such a dad.
I know I am such a dad. I'm looking down on my beer belly right now. So, but you know,
All right.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you next week.
All right, see ya.
Torture guard.